1/3 of all the clean energy that is out there. It's of nuclear origin.
This week, energy in abundance with virtually no emissions. What role does nuclear play in the race to net zero?
There has been a nuclear accident in the Soviet Union, and the Soviets have admitted that it happened.
The Soviets are saying little, but what is known is cause for concern: a nuclear accident.
But 10 years on from Fukushima and 35 from Chernobyl, is fission still too dangerous to be relied on?
They're a lot safer, but in ways that they're also a lot simpler from an engineering and a technology perspective, and that can make them cheaper.
Plus, the scientists trying to improve safety, cut costs, and carve out a role for nuclear power in the future. I'm Anne-Marie Hordern, and this is Bloomberg Green. Nuclear fission is probably the most controversial energy technology when it comes to the climate debate. While some countries like Germany are looking to phase out nuclear power, others like Japan say it'll be critical to reach its net zero targets. Here in the UK, though, nuclear power produces around 20% of the country's electricity, with several new plants planned. But for the United States, the future of large-scale nuclear power stations is less clear. Indian Point Energy Center in New York, which produced more than 10% of the state's energy at its peak, shut down at the end of April, and we took a closer look at why and what will replace it.
Nuclear is in a crisis mode.
Nuclear power provides the greatest amount of carbon-free generation that the U.S. has today.
35 miles north of Manhattan, 2 nuclear reactors provided around 25% of the electricity for the Big Apple.
You do the math, you understand why Indian Point's closure is absolutely the only smart move.
But losing a nuclear reactor hurts the U.S.'s goals of a carbon-free future.
This is the decade we must make decisions that will avoid the worst consequences of the climate crisis.
This is a story of Indian Point Energy Center and how the closed power plant can impede zero emissions goals and be a specter of a vanishing atomic future.
Well, it used to be that Indian Point was an amusement park, which is kind of amazing to me.
Families took boats up the Hudson River to Buchanan, New York to ride the roller coasters.
There's 300 miles of the Hudson River. It's been a conduit for commerce, haven for recreation.
Nuclear reactors require a lot of water to keep them cool.
They must have looked at that property and thought, oh, this is a great place for a nuclear plant.
Con Edison acquired the land in 1954. The company finished construction of the Unit 1 nuclear reactor in 1964. 2 more reactors followed.
Unit 2 went online in 1974 and Unit 3 in 1976. And then in 2000, Entergy purchased Unit 3 from the state and Unit 2 from Con Ed.
When both of those reactors were operating, it supplied about 25% of the electricity to New York City.
It's a very valuable piece of power.
Before we continue about Indian Point, what is nuclear power?
Fission nuclear power is splitting of heavy elements like uranium into smaller particles, and in the process of doing that, releasing a tremendous amount of energy. That energy in the form of heat is used to heat water that is then turned into steam, and that steam goes ahead and spins a turbine and generates electricity.
Nuclear is complex technology, obviously.
This is Michael Schellenberger. He's an author, and he's advocated for nuclear power in front of Congress.
But the plants themselves, they're just power plants. There's steam generators that spin turbines that make electricity.
Over the years, attitudes started to shift towards Indian Point.
There's 2 reasons. The combination's a lot of political opposition from environmental groups to go ahead and close the nuclear power plant because they were scared, especially in the wake of Fukushima, that a similar accident could happen over here.
Riverkeeper has been watching the Indian Point power plant for decades. We've observed that as the plant ages, it becomes more of a safety risk beyond its failure to comply with the Clean Water Act. The Indian Point plant consumes more water every day than the city of New York. And after 9/11, we realized that as this plant ages, it becomes more and more of a risk to the 20 million people who live within 50 miles.
Entergy disputes those claims, pointing to large investments in plant safety and reliability.
There were people on all sides of this issue. There were people that never wanted the plant here, and other people recognized the value to the economy.
Then, in 2017, amid contract discussions, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo and Entergy made a decision.
I've personally been trying to close it down for 15 years. Finally, this year, I'm proud to announce that we have an agreement. Indian Point will close in 4 years, 14 years ahead of schedule.
In addition to environmental concerns, the economics in an unregulated power market no longer made sense.
In January 2017, Entergy announced that it was shutting down Indian Point Unit 2 by 2020, Unit 3 by 2021. The primary decision was related to a drop in wholesale power prices.
I mean, the big story in energy, of course, over the last decade and a half is the fracking revolution, which made natural gas really cheap in the United States, and that's put price pressure on both coal plants and nuclear plants in some places.
The decommissioning process will take around 15 years. New Yorkers will be safer from the risk of a disaster at the plant, but what will replace the lost energy?
Between 2017 and 2021, when they were planning on decommissioning the reactors, almost 2 gigawatts of fossil-fired power came online within 50 miles of Indian Point. So unfortunately, we are replacing, in the immediate future, the electricity generated by Indian Point not by renewables, but by fossil fuels in the form of those natural gas power plants.
And Indian Point, I think, stands as a dramatic warning that carbon emissions will go up.
We have very, very ambitious goals. The President administration has also said that it wants to have a carbon-free electrical power system by 2035.
It's not possible to radically reduce your carbon emissions or your use of fossil fuels without nuclear power. The nuclear right now provides a little bit under 20% of our electricity. I think the Biden climate legislation gives so much subsidies to solar and wind that it could end up accelerating the closure of nuclear plants and thus have a counterproductive impact in terms of emissions. You know, when the sun sets is when people come home from work and start to use all their power. So there's no innovation to solar panels that can make them work better at night. And wind, similarly, is not reliable, especially if you think that weather is becoming more extreme.
Nuclear power plants, they're a very, very dense source of electricity that generates a lot of electricity all the time. The power sources of the future will be a combination of renewables and nuclear power if we are really serious about reaching net zero in the time frames that the current administration has gone ahead and identified.
Indian Point Unit 3 is the 12th reactor to close since the beginning of 2013. Right now, there are 55 sites and 93 reactors in operation. Reactors in Michigan and California are expected to close in the next few years. And there are 2 advanced reactor sites under construction in Georgia that have exceeded original budgets.
I mean, the most important thing for the United States to do right now is to keep our nuclear power plants operating and build more reactors similar to the ones that are already in construction in Georgia. Nuclear is both scary and beneficial for the same reason. I think a lot of people have viewed the ability to do that as a curse or that we'll be in trouble with the gods. But I think that increasingly people understand it as a blessing. Nuclear power plants cannot go off like a weapon and they don't depend on weapons or vice versa. But it's sort of the anxieties from one have displaced onto the other. And that's why you get people that believe things that just aren't true.
So how does nuclear power fit into our energy future?
There's a lot of policy mechanisms that policymakers at the state or the federal level can use. But I think really what matters is being able to explain to people why nuclear is an important technology that's here to stay. It's not something that we could or should try to get rid of. And so we need to make the most of it.
Coming up, the history of nuclear power is one of big promises and grave consequences. 35 years on from the Chernobyl disaster, we speak to the International Atomic Energy Agency about how to make the industry safer. This is Bloomberg Green.
This is Bloomberg Green. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja in New York with your Green Brief.
America's biggest meat company is giving faux burgers another shot. Tyson Foods is debuting its first vegan burger. A previous attempt at a half-plant, half-meat patty was a flop. This time, the lineup is 100% vegan and includes fake bratwurst and sausage. It adds to the crowded alt-meat space dominated by the likes of Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods. Germany is planning to spend an extra 5 billion euros to slash emissions from its steel industry. The country is stepping up the efforts to hit increasingly strict climate goals. The money will go towards supporting hydrogen projects by steelmakers. It will also be used to smooth the transition to low-emission metal production. And global efforts to save dwindling supplies of ocean fish are facing a moment of truth. Decades of talks could result in a deal this summer to end the government subsidies that fuel overfishing. Without an agreement, environmentalists are warning there could be a global hunger crisis. Many coastal communities rely on the fish for their diets. And that's your Green Brief. Anne-Marie?
Thanks, Jen. Boundless energy, zero emissions, the triumph of science. These are the dreams of nuclear power. But Fukushima, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, these are its nightmares. 35 years after the meltdown at Chernobyl, technology has advanced leaps and bounds. Many scientists say nuclear power is now safe and will play a key part in a net zero future. But the disaster continues to inform public attitudes, and its legacy is not easily forgotten, especially for those who were there.
В разные стороны с потолка начала сыпаться всякая строительный мусор, пыль. Из-под ног начала, как говорится, уходить земля, и погас свет.
This is Victor Ivkin. He was working at the Chernobyl power plant when one of the world's worst nuclear accidents unfolded.
There has been a nuclear accident in the Soviet Union, and the Soviets have admitted that it happened.
The Soviets are saying little, but what is known is cause for concern. A nuclear accident.
Den värsta som någonsin inträffat, tror man idag.
What caused it and how many people did it hurt?
30 years later, Victor is back in Chernobyl to revisit the control room where it all happened.
Which are telling the
Почувствовали услышали сильный низкочастотный гул, с которого заложило уши, и начали ходить строительные конструкции. Те 45 секунд, которые даны для разворота резервных дизель-генераторов, конечно, они показались вечностью. Страх был после смены. Там не было страха. Там. Ну вот, где-то после 11 я появился. Быстро в ванную, одежду под ванну спрятал. Принял ванну, говорю, Нина, сделай мне что-то покушать. Попытался покушать, ну и тут началось у меня.
Там говорили, что рецепт есть водки выпить?
Да, обязательно. После таких случаев, естественно, утром, когда перед тем, как я попробовал сесть покушать, естественно, принял спиртного. Вот. Ну, тем самым, и, как мне врачи сказали, что я спас себе желудочно-кишечный тракт. То есть... Посетить цвинтар, и там средний возраст, может быть, будет 45-50 лет. То есть это о чем-то говорит. Люди, которые находятся рядом с нами, с такими, как мы, имели чуть... Как сказать? Не сожаление. Сожаления нам не надо. Сожаления нам не надо. Я знаю, что наши люди достаточно гордые в себе. Хотя бы чуть-чуть сочувствия. И это уже немаловажный фактор будет для человека, который в свое время сделал все возможное и невозможное. Многие сделали даже невозможное для человека, чтобы сегодня было сегодня.
Anti-nuclear sentiment has never gone away following Chernobyl and resurged strongly after the Fukushima disaster in 2011. Some governments have steered clear of investing in nuclear energy, and as we have already seen, other plants are being decommissioned. I spoke to the International Atomic Energy Agency about cleaning up the industry's image.
Precisely this week, I was in Chernobyl, working with our Ukrainian colleagues, still remembering what happened 3.5 decades ago. So the one thing we need to do is to confront these concerns and to be clear and transparent about the issues and the problems underlying this. So because societal consent is essential in the free world, at least. Chernobyl is a reality. Of course, Fukushima is a reality. But when you look at the net effects on the environment, on humans, you will see that the record in terms of nuclear safety is sterling. There is also this issue of sometimes the perception that nuclear weapons and nuclear energy are interlinked. And if you add on top of that, or you put in the pot these accidents, well, in the end, it seems to be something problematic. But the reality is that it is not.
Yeah, it seems it has at times a bit of a PR problem. Are small modular reactors the way to go?
It's part of the way to go. First of all, we have what we have. And the nuclear fleet is very important because it's providing this clean energy and is preventing these billions of tons of CO2 going up in the air. This is very important. And of course, the new generation of reactors will be important, but and we pay a lot of attention to them in terms of the design, in terms of the control, in terms of the safety. But I wouldn't like to give the impression that this contribution of nuclear is something that will come someday in the form of some new reactor that does not exist.
Recently, Japan decided they're going to start dumping some water from Fukushima into the sea. This was met with some controversy. Is it safe?
It's safe to do it in the right way. If you don't do it in the right way, it's a disaster. Let me explain. What you have there is water that has been used to cool down these stricken reactors. It is there. It is stored. So what you need to do is treat it so you decontaminate it. You take away the dangerous radionuclides that are there. The thing is that through the IAEA, what you have is a neutral, technically impartial player that is going to be there measuring, monitoring, seeing to it that whatever goes into the ocean does not cause any harm to the marine sediment, the water, or the fish.
Do you see more countries wanting to implement nuclear because of climate change goals?
I think it's a combination. Climate change has indeed played a role. In terms of climate change, I would say it's more the confirmed users, those who have nuclear power and that are at the same time very coal dependent economies, and they need, should I say desperately, or at least urgently, to lower their emissions because their figures are very bad. But it's mostly for development. Here I have the African countries, the Latin American countries, developing countries that need to recover better, as we say now, in a hopefully post-pandemic world in a few months.
Coming up, as the U.S. says that nuclear power will play a significant role in its future energy mix, we speak to one of the scientists trying to revolutionize the sector. This is Bloomberg Green. From Bloomberg's European headquarters in London, I'm Anne-Marie Hordern, and this is Bloomberg Green. In the United States, President Biden thinks nuclear has a significant part to play in a green transition, so much so that he's expanding America's nuclear network. But nuclear power remains controversial, and investment has stalled since its peak. Professor Jessica Lovering, the co-founder of the Good Energy Collective, a group researching nuclear's role in decarbonization, says fears are outdated thanks to revolutionary technologies.
It's really a question of balance. We could physically fully decarbonize the energy system with 100% renewables, but it would be a lot harder, it would take a lot longer, it would cost a lot more. So nuclear is a really good complement to other clean energy sources, and it helps bring down the system-wide costs because nuclear, once it's up and running, it generates electricity 24/7 every day of the year. And so it's very reliable and what we call in the energy systems world firm power. So it's really good to have in your mix.
You mentioned the cost of renewables would be too much, but isn't the cost of nuclear quite high? What's being done to bring those costs down?
Yeah, so the way we've done nuclear in the past is to build these very large plants, and they do generate cheap electricity in the long run because they run for 60, 80 years, and they produce a lot of electricity, but those upfront costs are really high. So there's a move now in the nuclear industry to actually move towards much smaller plants that can be built more like a commercial product, more like a jet turbine or even a large aircraft on an assembly line in a factory setting. And that would hopefully bring costs down through standardization, through learning by doing. And so that's where a lot of people that are working on nuclear technologies are looking today, going smaller to take advantage of those economies of factory production.
So you see smaller nuclear designs. What are the safety concerns surrounding this?
Yeah, so we're moving towards very different nuclear technologies, although they've been known and around since the 60s or 70s. Actually, commercializing them is quite new. And most of them rely on different kinds of safety features than the large plants we operate today, what we call passive safety or inherent safety features. So they rely, to put it simply, kind of laws of physics rather than complex engineered systems to maintain their safety. So they can't have the type of accidents that we've seen in the past, like at Fukushima and Chernobyl. They can't have those fuel meltdowns, those escapes of radioactive material. And so they're a lot safer, but in ways that they're also a lot simpler from an engineering and a technology perspective, and that can make them cheaper. So sometimes people think if it's safer, it's going to be more expensive, but actually with nuclear, you can get a lot more safety and lower costs if you design the reactor right.
The other big question mark when it comes to nuclear is what do you do with nuclear waste?
There's been some good policy ideas of how to move forward on waste, setting up some interim sites. There's also people who want to look into doing fuel recycling, which would cut down the volume of waste. And there's some new companies actually that are innovating new technologies for what to do with waste. So different ways to store it more safely, more securely, deeper underground. So there's a lot going on. And again, it could actually benefit from some government support as well. We've seen so much innovation on the generation side, on the nuclear power plant side. Would love to see more on nuclear waste as well, but also probably need more some policy innovations, not so much technology innovations on waste.
That's it for this week's edition on nuclear fission. We'll be covering nuclear fusion in a future episode. You don't want to miss it. But for now, keep the conversation going. Follow us on Twitter @Climate. I'm Anne-Marie Hordern, and this is Bloomberg Green.